Thank you so much for joining us really early today for this workshop. Today, Patricia and I will be discussing how to run an effective lab or tutorial, both online and in person, and we're specifically tailoring this for students who are in the science and engineering departments. So just a quick intro for myself. I'm a second-year PhD student, and I'll be giving a little more background on a later slide about my history as a GA. But I'm in the mechanical engineering department, and I started this program last May, and I'm really excited to be here today. And the other person today, the other facilitator, is Patricia.
Okay, hi guys. My name is Patricia, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Integrative Biology.
Awesome. So just as a quick warning for everyone here, today's session will be recorded. So anything that's said on mic or the video, and also all the chat messages will be recorded, and people will be able to access that after the workshop.
Okay, so feel free to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable. We're going to have a breakout room activity towards the end of today's workshop. And during your breakout rooms, when you get into your breakout rooms, it might be helpful to turn on your camera because there'll be a small group of you, and it might help make conversation easier in the breakout rooms. Please remember to stay on mute when you're not speaking. When you're in the breakout rooms, this won't be necessary, but while you're in the main room, so we're in the main room right now, please remember to keep yourself on mute. Feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or to pop it in the chat, and we'll do our best to to monitor the chat if we see any questions. And also, if you do decide to turn the camera, pet appearances are appreciated. Okay, so I would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we're meeting today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. As a visitor on this land coming from Nigeria, I strive to deepen my own understanding of the local indigenous communities to reframe my responsibilities to the land and the community. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures.
So the University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We acknowledge both land and water as well as the treaties pertaining to this territory, and we acknowledge the Haudenosaunee who we share this territory with. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place, in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits, Le Détroit of Detroit.
From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and to consider how we are, and each in our own way, can try to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
There is an ancient proverb which goes, "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. We owe it to the children of these lands, past, present, and future, to provide them with the best, most truthful education in which they can learn, grow, and be inspired." So with that, we'd like to dive right into the material for today. So this is an outline for our presentation. We're going to start off by an introduction of myself and Patricia. Then we'll go into an introduction of how science and engineering labs and tutorials work, both in person and online. Then we'll discuss setting the tone with your students. And then we're going to do a quick breakout group activity where you'll be broken into groups and we can have some discussion. Then we're going to go through some student survey feedback. So this is feedback from students that we've GA'd in the past on what they thought was most effective and least effective in terms of techniques of running labs and tutorials. Then we'll go over some practical tips that we've picked up over the last few semesters as being GAs and TAs. Then we'll go over mental health resources that can be very helpful right now and inclusivity. So just as a quick more background on myself, my name's Ashley. I'm the second-year PhD candidate in Mechanical Automotive Materials Engineering Department. So I started my PhD last May, so I've been all online for my PhD. So that whole time I've been doing GA positions all online. So I've done heat transfer, fluid mechanics, and thermofluids. And next semester I'm going to be doing fluid mechanics again. Back about 8 years ago, I was a GA when I was at the University of Windsor doing my master's as well. So that was all in person. And I was a GA for engineering measurements as well as engineering and design. So I kind of have an experience both in person and online. I can kind of discuss the differences and how it can be a little more difficult as a GA now that we've moved online.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Patricia, and I am a third year PhD candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology. So my research or my project, I work in an entomology and plant ecology lab. So I study insect behavior, how the environment affects insect behavior, how insects interact with their environment and with each other. And currently my PhD project is actually on like applied entomology. So basically looking at how we can use insects for our own benefits. So you can see applied entomology in like biological control or even in waste management or in pollination, right? So those are all areas of applied entomology. So unlike Ashley, I've had kind of like had half of my PhD online and then the other half in person. So and the two classes that I usually GA, like because I end up doing the same courses every year, is insect evidence, which is a fourth year biology course, and also I think a third year forensics course, and med micro, which is a third year microbiology class. So I have a bit of perspective of what it's like to GA both online and in person. Okay, so Ashley, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So, so what was GAing like for you last semester?
I had a really good experience last semester. I was GAing heat transfer, which it was my second time doing it online. I'd also done it last summer. And well, first, I love heat transfer. It's probably my favorite subject. It's what my research is kind of focused on. And the professor is also my supervisor, so that also helped. But on top of that, I really like working with the students. I really like marking, which is usually one of the kind of like daunting tasks that you kind of have to get through when as a GA because it takes up so much time. But I actually enjoy marking quite a bit. And yeah, it was a really good overall experience. There were obviously issues working online, not being able to see the students was kind of difficult. But I really enjoyed it overall. So Patricia, I have a question for you as well. So I was wondering, what struggles have you faced as a GA?
I think the biggest one that comes to mind for me is just trying to keep on top of everything. So like time management, because I'm sure like, everyone probably knows now that being online makes it very easy to procrastinate. It makes it very easy to say, oh, I'll get to it later. Oh, I'll get to it later. And then, there isn't later and you feel really overwhelmed very quickly. So I think that is definitely like in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges with being online and being a GA online because as a GA, like, we're GAs, but we're also still students and we still have like other responsibilities as students, as grad students that we have to perform. And between emails and getting to students and preparing for the labs that you have to teach, it can get a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we have a few questions for you guys because we would like to get to know you a little bit. So for those of you that are here, could you tell us in the chat what program you're in? Oh, computer science, okay.
A lot of computer science.
A lot of computer science.
Cool. Film and
Ooh,
media
film
arts.
and media arts. Yeah.
I saw biochem,
Heat
electrical
transfer, your
engineering.
favorite.
Yeah, heat transfer. Um, I saw civil, electrical engineering.
English and creative writing. Oh wow, there is just a diverse group of people here today.
That's awesome.
Well, it is all nice to meet. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
So the next question we have for you is, have you been a GA or TA in the past? Or is this going to be your first semester as a GA or TA? Seems like the majority is this is going to be their first. Oh, fourth GA. Okay. First time GA, was a TA before. Okay. So yeah, it looks like we have quite a few people who are going into their very first time being a GA or TA. So I think that we're going to give you a lot of tools today that will help you, and you can feel more confident going into the experience, which it should be a good experience overall. I always enjoyed my GA and TA
It's
experiences.
an exciting experience.
Yeah. All right. So I just want to give a brief introduction into how science and engineering labs and tutorials work, both in person and online. So most of you have probably been on the student side of a tutorial or a lab in science or engineering. So you kind of have an idea of what the GAs and the TAs are there to do. So for the most part, they're there to help the students succeed. They're there to answer questions. And they're also there to help the professor in marking, because there can be very large class sizes and there's just not enough time for the professor to mark everything. So they'll give that out to some of the GAs or TAs to help save some time. And that back when we were in person, a lot of the times the labs, the tutorials, you would go on campus and the GAs or TAs would be there with you during your tutorials, labs, experiments, whatever you're working on. But now that we've gone online, it's become a little bit more difficult, I'd say, as a GA or TA. And there's a few reasons for that. The first one is that you can't see the students. In my experience, it's very rare that the students will want to turn on their cameras during a tutorial or lab. And that has a lot to do with it being like a large class, and you wouldn't have room to see everyone, so everyone just keeps their cameras off for the most part. And that can be kind of difficult, especially if you're trying to explain a concept, because you don't get to see their facial expression. You don't know if they're giving you like a confused look or if they're just nodding along. So it's a lot more difficult to kind of gauge, is this person understanding where I'm coming from? Is there something I could explain better? The next thing is marking online. That has its own set of challenges. You have to learn how to use Blackboard for marking. So that's where you're going to input all of your marks for the most part. The difficult part that I've noticed marking online is that back when we were in person, you would have like a stack of midterms, for example, and I'd be responsible for one question to mark, and another GA would be responsible for the next question. So I would mark it and I would just hand it over to the next GA. And we'd have like an assembly line, and by the end, they'd all be marked. But now that we're online, it can be a little more difficult. There's been situations where people mark an exam, like I mark question 1, and then another person marks question 2, but we didn't start from the same point. So now we have 2 separate copies that are marked on different questions, and they're not together. And you don't want to give back 2 copies of the exam to the student. So then you end up having to mark again, and it can be a little bit more difficult. And more, you have to just coordinate it a little better among the GAs. The third thing is procrastination, and as Patricia was mentioning earlier, it can be a lot easier to procrastinate when you're online. You don't have the people around you reminding you you have to have these things done. It's really on yourself to get everything done and make sure your marking's done on time, make sure you're logging into the tutorials on time. And then you have less interaction with your fellow GAs and TAs, which is kind of like one of the sad point of this whole thing, because back when we were in person, like you could kind of develop a friendship with your GAs and TAs. You're seeing them on such a regular basis. But now that we're online, I've had whole semesters where the only really interaction I have is through email. I never even seen some of my fellow GAs or TAs. And then finally, there's technical difficulties, which are just always present no matter who you are. There's always going to be situations with internet going out, mics not working, cameras not working, assignments don't get submitted on time. Like anything can happen when you're online, really. So we're hoping today that we can give you some tools that will be a little helpful for solving some of these issues. And we can kind of share the things that we've gone through over the last few years as being GAs and TAs. And yeah, so we're excited to be here to share that information with you, and hopefully you can have more confidence going into this next semester.
So I'd like to talk to you guys about setting the tone, and I hope that at the end of this session, it'll give you some more confidence walking into your classroom with your students. So at the core of setting the tone is just a way to develop mutual respect for both you and your students. So the university is moving into a high flex model, and that basically means that there are going to be classes that are going to be online, there are going to be classes that are going to be in person, and there's going to be classes that are going to have, I think, asynchronous online sessions while also having the option to come on campus if you prefer. And with this new model, it's going to present a lot of its own unique challenges in comparison to what things have been like before. Like GAing, even without a pandemic, just looming over us, can be challenging because we're in this space of being educators, without any formal training, but still being students. And that's a hard space to navigate, in my opinion. So I'm hoping that today, when we talk about setting the tone, that it's going to give you a little bit more confidence when you walk into the classroom. So setting the tone with your students allows both you and your students to have a successful experience. Setting the tone is about clear communication, it's about setting boundaries, it's about just knowing that both you and your students are on the same page about what is occurring when we're in this learning space. So setting the tone is going to look different for all of you. Like we have a diverse group of people here. There's, like film, arts. I think I saw sculpture somewhere, visual art sculpture. I didn't even know what GAing that would be like. Lots of computer science, engineering, and all these different programs, the labs and the GA programs are going to be different and they're going to be unique. So setting the tone isn't going to look the same for all of us. But I'm hoping that, you can kind of get some tools and mold it into what best suits your program or what best suits the classes that you have to teach. So depending on, how the labs are designed, the kind of autonomy you have as a GA, because some, labs are very like strict and I don't want to use the word rigid, but just there's a certain way that things have to be done, while some labs are more, you're kind of in control and you can sort of choose how you decide to run the lab. So, based on that like wide breadth of what the labs could look like, setting the tone is going to be different for everybody, especially with class size, right? It's easier to manage a smaller group of people than it is like a lab of, say, over 50 people. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about my experience with one of the labs that I GA, so insect evidence. So insect evidence, it's also called applied entomology. It's a fourth year biology class, and I believe also a third or fourth year forensics course. So for that lab, I get a lot of forensic students and a lot of biology students. So for me, the way I set the tone for my lab is first, I want my students to be able to relate to me because I don't want them to fear me. I want them to feel very comfortable being able to express their ideas. I want them to feel very comfortable being able to even like make a joke with me while we're in lab, stuff like that. And one of the ways that I accomplish that is I always tell my students, like the first day of class, I always tell them a story about how I sort of like started in entomology. And it's a story from when I was really little. So I'm going to tell you guys. So when I was little, I was like young, we had a big backyard and I would always go out and like try to catch grasshoppers or crickets, because I wanted to keep them as pets. So I'd catch them, I'd pull off like their jumping legs and their wings, and I'd build little cages for them, and I'd just bring them into the house. And my mom hated it because there were just bugs everywhere all the time. So, and back then, I didn't even know that being an entomologist was a career path. That was something that I was going to get into eventually, you know? So my love for insects started when I was really, really little. And I find that I about my passions, when I talk about my research, you know, what I'm doing, what led me into what I'm doing, you know, students know a little bit more about you, right? It humanizes you as someone that's just like somebody else, that you're a person, you know, that you were young, you were silly too once upon a time. So I find that, like, you know, things like that, it helps with sort of bridging the gap and bringing them closer to help, you know, make everyone comfortable in the classroom, so that when you speak, that when you're teaching, when you're explaining things to them, they're a bit more receptive of what you're saying. So I just gave an example of pretty much how I start to set the tone in my classroom, and I'm gonna give you guys a lot of other suggestions, and I'm sure that, you know, you guys could even think of even more than what I have on the slide about ways to help you set the tone for your class. So, like I said, introducing yourself to your students, telling them about your research, your program. Talking about your research is a really good way to make a connection with your students. When I was an undergrad, I didn't even know that going into research was a thing. I didn't know that, you know, grad school was a thing. I only really thought that the only like further education you could do was maybe going to med school or going to law school or like stuff like that. You know, I didn't know that you could go into academia. And it was through one of my GAs talking about their research, talking about what they were doing, you know, in school, that inspired me to say, oh, I didn't even realize this was an option, you know, and I started seeking out labs to volunteer. And that was really how I got my foot into research. So when you talk about your research, especially if your research is in line with the lab that you have to GA, you could really work that into the lab, you know, and that could be an opportunity where you inspire somebody to go into grad school, you know, but we have no idea what that could do for them. Depending on the class size and depending on how long your labs or your tutorials are going to run, it might also be useful to allow your students to introduce themselves to you. Of course, this might not be possible depending on like class size and timing, but even maybe every time someone asks a question or you walk up to someone to ask, walk up, sorry, the classes are online. But when someone asks a question, you might maybe like ask them a little bit more about themselves. You know, that could be a way for you to get to know them. Icebreaker games are a really good one. So these icebreaker games can be made into like little quizzes about the lab. They could really be about anything, you know, but like you can connect them into what the lab is about. And you use that as a way to like get to know your students and for your students to get to know you as well. Now, this is a really, really important one. So stating clearly what you expect, what they can expect from you as a GA and what you expect from them as your students. So for this, it might be really useful for you to talk to the course instructor to come to like, you know, come up with an understanding of, you know, what do you both expect from the students in this lab, right? And then when you up, you could tell them, you can write it out like, you know, as like outcomes or expectations. And you can tell them, this is what you can expect from me as a GA. You know, I will reply to emails, you know, like in a timely manner, like within 24 hours. You know, I'll be available for help, like whatever, depending on what lab you're teaching, you can write out what they can expect from you, how, you know, how they can rely or depend on you as a GA for that semester. And then you could tell them, this is what that is expected of you as a student in this course during the semester. I find that when everyone is on the same page about what is going on, you can have a very productive time. So when everyone is on the same page about what their expectations are, every time you meet, your meetings are very productive because everyone knows exactly what is going to happen or exactly what we're here for. And again, this might depend on, you know, the last one might depend on how much autonomy you have for the labs that you're GAing, but coming up with a list of class rules together with your students might be very helpful. And this could also be something that you could talk to the course instructor about. You know, when students, you know, misbehave in a certain way, what are the agreed upon consequences of that behavior?
All right, so we have another question for the participants here today. So do you guys know what sort of things GAs and TAs normally do, both when they're in face-to-face tutorials and labs for a regular term? So like what are the GAs and TAs responsible to do in and for the tutorials? And you can go ahead and write it in the chat if you have any ideas. Answer questions, exactly. Yeah. Guide the students, regulate the lab, grading, yeah. Lead the tutorial, answer questions, prep lab equipment and chemicals, yeah, definitely. Solving assignments, help the students, safety is a big one. Provide feedback on assignments. Handle technical issues, yes, that's a huge part now that we're online. Clear doubts, yes. Fix errors in programs, definitely. And showing an example of a lab technique. Yeah, these are all really great answers. It seems like definitely you guys have either been GAs or TAs, or you've worked with GAs or TAs because you know exactly what GAs and TAs need to do during labs and tutorials. And practice the examples with them. Yes, definitely.
Yes, talking about the regulations and rules, give them ideas for projects. Absolutely. These are all really, really good, good responses. Okay, so now we have another question for you guys. So now that you've told us what GAs, would do in person, now what sorts of things, my GAs and TAs be doing for online labs and tutorials? Okay, office hours, that's pretty good. Yeah, we can have office hours online.
Yeah. And the hold quizzes. That's something that, yeah, you definitely can do both in person and online.
Answer emails is a lot, yep.
Yes.
Yes, online help for your teams or
Yeah.
email.
A
It's
lot of teams.
really the responsibilities, they overlap a lot. The only difference really is that you're not physically there in person, like doing it with them.
Exactly.
Blackboard assignments and discussion posts, yes, absolutely.
Yep.
Trying to help kids understand, yeah. Word concepts as hands-on activity, yep.
Labs should be practical, how they are held online. Yeah, these are all really great answers.
So a lot of the things that GAs do online translate to, sorry, that GAs do in person translate to what we do online as well. So grading, answering emails, holding office hours. While we're not there in person doing like demonstrations with them, some of us have to film like videos ahead of time to show the students like, this is how you do this is how you, work with this chemical, things like that. Oh, this is a question. So unfortunately, like, with the pandemic, particularly last year at the height of the pandemic, like we couldn't be together in person. So we had to adapt most of the labs into online forms. So for example, like one of the labs that I GA is microbiology, and microbiology is a very hands-on lab, right? Students like learning microbiology techniques, learning safety practices, stuff like that. And what we had to do was pre-record a lot of the techniques ahead of time and show them to the students. We found a really good online program that basically helped us adapt a lot of the labs into like these little programs that the students can go, like there were little simulation programs that they could use, and it basically simulates like being in a lab. And when you come into a lab, what do you do first? What do you pick up first? And that was a really good way for the students to remember those like safety practices that they had to do when they had to be in lab physically. I hope that answered that question. So a really good teaching model that I would suggest for a lot of you, this might not look exactly the same for everybody, is the predict, observe, and explain. Okay, so to predict, so you describe to the students what you're going to demonstrate, and you ask them to predict the outcome and justify their prediction. So I could, because I'm in the sciences, I can really see how you can do this in like a physics lab or like a chemistry lab or even a computer science lab. The when you ask students to predict, well, what do you think is going to happen when I do this? And you ask them to predict and justify why they think that thing is going to happen. And then you observe, you carry out the activity or the process or the demonstration, and you ask the students to note what actually happens. Then you explain. So depending on if the students, made the right predictions, you can help ask the students to hypothesize why things happened the way that they happened. I find that the best way, I'm sure people might disagree with me on this, but I think that the best way to learn is through mistakes. When you think back to a lot of what you know, a lot of things you don't forget because maybe you made a mistake the first time. And usually, once you've made a mistake about something and you learn from it, you're unlikely to make that mistake a second time. And that's basically what this model is about: to predict, observe, and explain. So I'm going to talk to you guys about what the labs that I've GA'd, what they're like. And then Ashley's going to talk to you about the labs that she's GA'd and what they're like. So because I'm in biology and she's in engineering, our labs are quite different. So first, I'm going to talk to you guys about the medical microbiology lab. So for that lab, usually how it runs is at first, we give students have to do like a safety quiz where so they can get like their safety completion code to let us know that they're basically ready to be in the lab in person or to be a part of the lab online. And then the next thing that we do for that lab is, you learn where all the safety stuff is, right? So in Med Micro Lab, we work with Bunsen burners, we work with level 1 and level 2 microorganisms. So knowing where the eye wash station is, where the fire blanket is, where the safety shower is, where the emergency gas shut off, fire alarm, all that kind of stuff is very important. So usually we get through all that safety stuff, right? We get through talking to them about coming into lab. What are the first things they need to do? Washing their hands, sanitizing their tables. What are safety microbiology techniques? When the lab was moved online, what we did was basically try to incorporate, like, being that the pandemic is a virus, it's caused by a virus, we basically try to like incorporate that into the lab to really get the students thinking outside the box because we couldn't have them because they couldn't be there physically in lab. We tried to make the experience as wholesome to incorporate as much as possible for them. Now, when I GA the insect evidence lab, it's quite different. So what I do for that, because insect evidence, the one of the biggest learning outcomes for that lab is basically for students to learn like basic insect anatomy, basic insect behavior, and just basic insect families and orders. So what I do for that lab is, and what I did last year when it was online, was I prepared these collection kits for the students. So I made the kits with all the stuff that they would need to collect insects, and I handed it off to the school library, and I gave them a class list. And I basically told the students, when you get to the library will be able to give you your collection kits, with like no contact. And I was grateful that the library was able to offer that service to me. So once, the students had their collection kits, we would meet online every Friday morning. I would, give like a short lecture about the different like, insect anatomy, basic insect body parts, physiology, reproduction, behavior, that sort of thing. And then I would talk to them about trapping techniques, right? How to capture insects in the wild. And I talked to them about how to identify insects, how to pin insects, because I knew that a big part of that class was the students being able to identify different insect orders and being able to identify different insect parts. We knew, the course supervisor and we knew that the insect collection kit is a really good way to achieve that, because when the students have to go out and collect insects, they would have to identify those insects. And in the process of identifying those insects, it reinforces some of those ideas and topics that we had been talking about in class, right? Because insect identification, different insects have, their heads and their antennae and, their body parts look different. So to be able to identify them, you have to know what those parts are. And we found that this was a really good way to reinforce the ideas, the topics, the lessons that we were talking about in class and translating that to a practical sense for the students. Okay, I'm going to give it over to Ashley. Oh, no, okay. I think she might have, yeah, I think her internet might have disconnected. Okay, does anyone have any questions about what I said? Absolutely. What the labs are going to look like for computer science is going to be very different from what the labs are going to look like for physics, and that's going to be very different from what the labs are going to look like for like biology. Absolutely, yes. A computer science lab, I'm sure, is going to look very different from what a biology lab would look like. And I think Ashley is back. Yay, she's back.
I am back. So my internet just went out. I have Codeco. So now I connected using my personal hotspot on my cell phone. So that's another tip for anyone. If your internet goes out, if you have the hotspot on your phone, that can work when you're in a pinch. So now from an engineering perspective, so I'd say 90% classes, in my experience, have been run in a very similar manner, where you will have weekly tutorials. I just want to check, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So the tutorials are run once a week. There'll be like a 2 or 3 hour session per week. And what happens in those tutorials is by the professor, and they're from the textbook, and they reflect whatever topic they're being taught for that week. And so as a GA or TA, your experience is going to be, first you'll be sent that list of questions ahead of time. Hopefully they give you at least a few days notice from the professor, so you have time to solve those questions yourself. Depending on the professor, they may or may not give you the solution. Most of the time they do, but sometimes they want you to solve them on your own. So you solve the problems, then you attend the tutorial. So now that we're online, you'll be logging into Blackboard, going to the virtual classroom, and you'll be there with all the students and the professor. And then depending on the class, a lot of the times they'll be broken out into groups. So you might be responsible for a certain set of groups, or sometimes the students are just allowed to go and solve the problems as they like. And then, so you're there in those groups, or maybe in just the main room, and your job is to help the students. So whenever they have questions, they can either ask for you specifically, or if you're in their group, you'll be responsible for answering all of their questions. And so yeah, that's like 90% of the time. That's how the tutorials are run, I'd say, in engineering. And then you're responsible for marking those tutorials. So usually the professor will give you some sort of marking scheme or how they want it to be marked. Certain professors have preferences on how things should be marked, so definitely pay attention to that. I'd say the majority of the time you'll get a specific, like this equation was worth half a mark and this final answer is worth half a mark, and you can just mark it according to that. Other professors are more focused on like stating the correct assumptions, drawing a schematic, etc. So yeah, this bottom left photo on this slide, that's taken from the fluids course that I was a GA last fall, and that I will be for this fall as well. So that's like a typical question that would be given. And then for labs, we also have labs that are separate from the tutorials in engineering. And the labs are usually some type of experiment. And back when we were in person, this would involve everyone going into CEI building on campus and you would go into one of the labs, and there'd be some apparatus. So this one in the bottom right was one that we used last semester in heat transfer. And back when we were in person, you would run the experiment as the GA or TA. So you'd have to prepare for that. You'd run the experiment, and the students would be recording values from the experiment, and then they'd have like a week or so to mark that lab. So there's a question, do we have an answer key for grading? So that depends on the professor. I'd say most of the time, the professor will give you the solution along with the questions. But there are some professors who prefer to just give you the questions and have you solve it on your own. And in that case, it's very important, if you don't know how to solve the problem, to let the professor know ahead of time so that you can kind of work through it. Yeah, that's my best suggestion. And then also for the labs, so talking about what we did when we were in person. Now that we're online, it's a lot more difficult because the students can't like come in and actually see what's happening. So a lot of the times it's a little bit more confusing. So what the professors have asked a lot of As and TAs to do in the last year is to go in and run those experiments and make a video of it for the students. And then that video gets posted on Blackboard, and the students have to record the values from the video and then do the lab report in the same way. And I'm going to, later in the presentation, when we get into the practical tips, I'll go over some tips for how you can make those videos as effective as possible if you're asked to do that. I'd say it's pretty rare because at this point, most of the classes have gone through a semester and they're just recycling those videos again and again. But it could happen that the professor wants to do a different lab or a different experiment one semester, and then you would be asked to do that. So we'll get into that in a later slide. All right. So this is another question for everyone here today. Do you know for the next semester, for the labs or tutorials that you'll be part of, what your role is going to be? So like, have you already had a discussion with your professor for the course on what your role is going to be? The vast majority of people have not had that discussion with the professors yet, and I'd say that's pretty typical. I haven't had office hours and grading, yes. I haven't had my meeting with my professor yet, but once you do, your professor should get in contact with you before the semester starts, and you'll have a quick meeting where you can go through exactly how many hours you're being allocated for that semester and how much time you should be spending on each task. So you'll have a certain number of hours for office hours, a certain number of hours to attend the tutorials. You'll have hours for marking, hours for prep so that you can be ready for the tutorials and the labs. And it's really up to you to kind of keep track of those hours and make sure you're not going over. At least that's how it's been in my experience. There might be some professors that want you to send them like weekly updates or something, but in my experience, I've just kept an where I track my own hours. And then if I get close to that threshold where I'm like, I might be getting a little too high on marking, for example, you can let the professor know, and they can either take some of the marking tasks over for you, or they can try and spread it out more evenly with the other GAs, depending on where they are in their hours as well.
So now we have another question for you guys. So what are you concerned about in terms of running and preparing for online labs and tutorials this semester? So I believe that there are workshops on Blackboard on how to use Blackboard and different like parts and aspects of Blackboard. I'm pretty certain that there are those workshops. I will talk to, we have one of the Blackboard moderators here with us today, and I'll talk to her about like, maybe sending those links to you guys at the end of the workshop.
Yes, I've done quite a few of those Blackboard workshops with, I think it's Mark Lubrick is his name that runs them. He's really great. And he's like an expert on Blackboard. He can answer pretty much any question. I think I missed a few.
So students not showing up, it's something that unfortunately we don't have any control over. So the best thing that you can do is just to be as prepared as you can be and come to class on time and just be right. The onus is on the students to show up for their classes and for their labs.
Yeah.
Not knowing how to answer, this might be unpopular opinion, but it's okay to not know the answer to a question. And it's okay to tell the students, you know what, I'm actually not 100% sure about this, but I will get back to you on it. And then you do well to just, whether it is to email that student the next day or have the answer for their question ready for them at the next lab section. For the technical issues, we've already had two today at the beginning with me and then actually the internet cutting out. I would say just the key to that, in my opinion, is to just take a deep breath and just, try to get through it. It's not, everyone understands that there are going to be technical issues, right? And it's not something that is in your control. So when they happen, just maybe shoot the students a quick, email on your phone saying, hey, I'm having technical issues. I'll try to log back on as soon as I can. Really helps. Concern about unruly students. So this is something, again, that like when that ties into what I talked about earlier with setting the tone, but also talking to the course instructor about how to handle those situations, because, you're a teaching facilitator. So having help from an experienced like professor on how they handle those situations will give you a lot of insight and give you a lot of confidence on how to deal with that situation when and if it arises in your classroom.
Yeah, definitely.
So I believe that there are English conversation groups organized by the International Student Center to help you practice your English more. But at the university, there's a diverse group of people here from so many different backgrounds. And as long as you just take a deep breath and just speak slowly and clearly, I believe that you will be fine. Everybody has an accent, even if it's a Canadian accent, it's an accent. So I would say, just showing up, being as motivated as you can be, having a very positive outlook on things, and, having a clear communication, not being afraid to say, I don't know, but getting back to that student as well, right? Students can tell when you're not motivated to be there with them, right? And they can tell, and I find that they get these better experiences from the GAs that they believe care, right? If you're as invested in their learning as they are, I find students get really excited. So offering office hours, being compassionate, letting the students know that if they don't understand something, it's totally okay for them to send you an email. If you're comfortable having like office hours where you just explain the situation, like, the concept to them or the problem to them, just the both of you, just offering students understanding that students are going to be different and being flexible enough to try to like deal with different students or assess different students' needs and trying to meet them the best that you can. So about the grading, Ashley is going to go really in depth about how to give good constructive feedback to your students. So that is going to answer that question at that time.
All right. So now, hi, can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you, Ashley.
Okay, I switched
Can
back to
everybody else hear
GATAcademy. I think it's working now. Okay. So I don't know where I left off, but we're going to do a breakout activity. You'll be put into a group. So right now we're in the main room, and we're going to put you into groups of 5 or 6 people. And then once you get into the room, introduce yourself. Pick a note taker / spokesperson, which will be the person explaining it when we get back. And then when you get into that room, that breakout room, just wait a moment, and Patricia and I will be there in a minute or so, and we're going to give you that question to discuss.
And we're going to limit, due to time, we're just going to limit the breakout rooms to about like 5 minutes. And then we'll bring you guys back and we'll discuss the different answers to the questions that you have, okay? So you'll be going into the breakout rooms now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the main room. So we're a little bit pressed for time, so we're going to try to get through the discussion as quickly as possible. So I believe group 1 and 10 had the first question. So what things can GAs and GAs and TAs do to help with student learning and motivation? Okay, I think someone. Okay, so making labs as collaborative as possible, absolutely. Being available and responding to students' needs, but also being sympathetic to the current situation. That's absolutely right. I'm helping students look at long-term goals, being friendly and approachable, check for students understanding more often. That's very true. You know, frequently stop and ask it if anyone has any questions, if everybody's following. Being open and helping resolve disputes. That's absolutely correct. Making the lab relate to real life situations where possible. That's totally true. More icebreaker activities, even quick ones. These are wonderful. These are even better than what I came up with. So yeah, you're on the right track. So I'm not completely sure how labs are going to run with art, but I think just being compassionate, being available to the students goes a really long way in helping and encouraging their learning. So try not to panic too much about what the things that you can't control, and focus on the things that are within your control and just do your best at that.
All right, it looks like group 7 posted their answer in the chat as well.
Okay, group 7, I believe you guys were what will GAs and TAs need to be effective in their roles?
So they have to be thorough with the course in which they are GA or TA. So any kind of problem is easy for them to handle. That can be pretty tough, especially if it's your first time. Being prepared for each session, definitely, and communicating effectively to get your views across to the audience. That's all huge, definitely. Group 2, so that would have been for the question, how can we provide online activities relating to what would normally be hands-on in the labs? Group 2 said creating videos of the experiments, definitely. Doing what you did with giving out lab equipment for students to pick up so they can try it at home, and having really good communication skills. Definitely. Yeah, being online, I think it just puts more emphasis on good communication.
Mm-hmm. And I think the same goes for group 9. They had the same question as well. How can we provide online activities relating to what we would normally do um, in like in-person labs? So sharing code snippets. I assume this is a lot of for computer science, simulation software for electrical and physics labs, resolving technical issues by using remote control functionalities of Microsoft and Blackboard Collaborate, using file sharing functionalities. Absolutely. So for group 10, you guys had the question, what things can GAs and TAs do to help students' learning and motivation? So doing more assignments and quizzes, doing things practically, answering questions during office hours. These are all ways that we can help, we can be there for the students and we can help them in their learning. So I haven't heard anything from the groups that had question 5 and question 4. No, yeah, question 5 and 4. So how can GAs and TAs maintain their own well-being and motivation while navigating online teaching and learning this semester? Okay, considering it as a learning experience for yourself as well, putting ourselves in the student's shoes to try to be empathetic to their experiences. Good time management is really, really good. So these are all really, really good answers.
Definitely. Great job, guys. I really like that one quote, the to teach something is to learn something twice. That definitely is true. All right, so now we're going to quickly go through some practical tips for when you're running labs and tutorials. So these are things that we've learned as GAs and TAs, and we want to share. So the first one is, a lot of these things have already been mentioned by you based on the last activity, but number one, preparing for tutorials and labs ahead of time is very important because it makes sure that you can clearly answer students' questions during the tutorials and labs. Because the worst feeling is when if you show up for a tutorial or lab unprepared and a student asks you a question and you have no idea what the answer is. That's the worst feeling. So make sure you prepare so you don't have to deal with that. And also, as Patricia mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to admit that you don't know something. Like, no one's expecting a GA or TA to know the textbook front to back. There's always going to be things that you don't know. So, but just when that situation happens, just let them know. I'll get back to you as soon as I can with an answer. Also, being open and flexible is very important because you have to remember that every student's situation is different and they're experiencing their online learning in a different way. Another thing is if you get into a situation where you're doing breakout rooms, like we did today, which is something pretty common that GAs and TAs will have to handle, make sure you introduce yourself when you enter the breakout room. You don't want it to seem like you're kind of like intruding in on a conversation. Just let them know you're there. And be careful when you're writing your chat messages because they can be easily misinterpreted. The next set of practical tips is number one, don't be afraid to ask your professor a question. I know, like, I've had that feeling where it's like you kind of want to impress the professor, make it look like you know the material really well, but like, it shouldn't be that way. Don't be afraid to ask a question. We're all here learning. Even the professor doesn't know everything about the topic. They probably know quite a bit, but maybe not every single thing. Another thing that's really helpful is in your first meeting with the professor, ask them what their preferred method of communication is in general, but also during labs and tutorials, because a lot of the time a question will come up during a tutorial. A student asks you something, you don't know the answer, and you want to be able to communicate with the professor. Some professors will like a quick Teams chat message, and other professors will find that kind of unprofessional. So try to set that right at the beginning so you don't have to deal with it in the moment. When you're unsure on how to respond to a student, confirm with your professor first. Okay, so when it comes to marking, which is a huge part of being a GA or TA, I'd say it's maybe about half of your time as a GA or TA, at least in engineering. The first thing is make sure you know when the marking needs to be done by. So ask your professor what their expectations are. Generally, in the courses that I've been a GA or TA for, it's 1 week from when the assignment was due. That's when they want you to have the marks complete and uploaded into Blackboard for them to review. If you have access to a tablet, I would highly recommend using that to do your marking because you can make your direct annotations right on the assignment. So that helps a lot because the students want to see, like, I made my mistake on question 2 in the assumption 3, for example, and they want to know like exactly where their issues. They don't want to have to search through like, wait, what did they mean? Like, where did those marks get taken off for? So if you have access to a tablet, I definitely recommend you could use apps like Notability or GoodNotes. I think there's also some free versions because those ones cost like $5, I think. So I highly recommend that. Also, I know, like, for the heat transfer course, for some of the GAs who didn't have a tablet available to them for marking midterms and finals, the professor actually had extra tablets that they lent out to the GAs and TAs who didn't have them. So that could also be a possibility. If a student wants to dispute a mark, ask your professor. Like, never try and solve the issue on your own. Always run it by the professor. See what they think. I talk about it with your professor first, but I would never go into Blackboard and change a mark that I've already uploaded for a student to see until I've had the professor's permission first. And that just makes sure that everything is being fair, because if you marked one student one way, that should be applied to everyone. So if there is something you did wrong in the marking, you might have to go back and change it for everyone. The last thing is something that I hadn't really considered when I started being a GA or TA. And this hopefully will not happen when you're a GA or TA, but there are some students, especially now that we've moved online, who will try and cheat or try to use information from online or from solution manuals. And one thing I noticed in a course that I was a GA for was that there were these 2 projects that were exactly the same, except one had like every fifth word was changed, like they had used a synonym kind of search thing. And I showed this to my professor, and they said, oh yeah, I know what this is. This is whatever website, and it was called some bot thing. So basically you can upload an assignment to that website and it will just change random words. So it doesn't even make sense anymore, which is how you can kind of tell. So yeah, just watch out for stuff like that. If you ever have a suspicion that there might be some cheating or academic integrity issues, talk to your professor. Don't try to like approach the student or anything. Get their opinion first, and it's better just to be safe than sorry. You don't want to accuse someone when they didn't actually cheat. So these next few slides are student survey feedback. So one thing that I recommend for you is, and this is something that I started doing a few semesters ago, at the end of the semester, I send out a survey to the students to get their feedback on how they thought we did as GAs and TAs, what they thought worked and what they thought didn't work. And then I try to like incorporate that in the next semester. So these surveys that I send out, they're anonymous and the questions are open-ended so that I can kind of gather things that maybe I hadn't even considered before. And I've kind of just summarized the trends in these slides. So the first thing that was a big trend in the feedback was that students want more help from the GAs and TAs to understand how tutorial questions relate to what they learned during the lecture that week. And so the students want the GAs and TAs to make connections for them. And what's difficult as a GA or TA when it comes to this is we aren't expected to attend the lectures, so we don't know what was taught that week. We just know what the tutorial questions are. So one thing I've found to be super effective is in that time you're allotted to prepare for a tutorial or lab, take 10-15 minutes and flip through the lecture slides that were given out that week, and do it right after you did the tutorial questions. And that way you'll be able to make those connections in your own mind. And then when a student asks a question, you can be like, oh yeah, you know, that question is, that's based on what you learned on Tuesday at the end of lecture 3. And you can say it's based on that table where you learned, you know, this. And just being the person who can kind of make those connections and clear things up, I think it can really help the students quite a bit. The next thing that students said quite a bit was that they want more written feedback so that they can improve from week to week. And I totally relate to this as a student as well. I want to know where I went wrong. I don't want to make that same mistake again on the next test. I want to be improving if I'm going to be losing marks. So that's, again, where the tablet comes in great. It's very handy to be able to identify right on their midterm or on their final where they lost the mark. And I'm saying, like, use the tablet as opposed to in Blackboard. The other option is to just write into a text box like -1 because you didn't do this. But then it becomes very difficult for them to have to figure out, well, what do they mean? Where did I do that in my assignment? I don't understand. And it just makes it more confusing. It's better if they can see directly on their assignment where the mark was lost. And it's difficult to learn from verbal feedback alone. They don't want to just hear it. They want to see it like a tangible thing on their assignment. The next thing was that students preferred working and communicating with their GAs and TAs who were wearing headsets. So I highly recommend that. Some built-in mics on laptops are really good. So in that case, you don't need a headset. But I recommend testing out your mic ahead of time. And that's assuming that you don't have issues like I had today with my internet and everything. So yeah, just try to prepare it as best as you can. Adding verbal explanations to videos to make them easier to understand. So just explaining, if you're asked to make a video of a lab, explaining as you go what's happening.
Okay, so these are some things to just keep in mind for this semester. So active learning methods are more effective than just lengthy lectures and passive reading, okay? So trying to incorporate like ways that students can actively engage with the material that you're giving them. So this could be quizzes, stuff like that. So like Ashley said, timely and constructive feedback is really important for growth. Showing up motivated for the class is really like a really important one as well, because motivation is infectious, right? So when you show up and you're excited, your students get excited as well. Also understanding that the students are coming into our classes with different prior knowledge, different experiences, different goals. So making sure that you're carrying everybody along, stopping frequently to ask, is everyone following? Does anyone have any questions? Is a really good way to make sure that everybody is following. So just a quick reminder, I'm hopefully by now most of us have signed our teaching contracts. And also maybe within the first few weeks of GAing, you go over your Form 1, which is just an outline of duties with the course instructor. So this is where they tell you what they want you to be doing, what you're going to be spending most of your time doing. So, the question when we ask is everybody know what they're going to be doing? This form is going to be the form that when you do it with the course instructor, you'll have a better idea of your roles and responsibilities. So what I was, what something that we would like to talk about today, we're almost at the end of this, is when you hear the words safe and inclusive learning, what does that mean to you? Okay, and while you guys type in the chat, I'm just gonna push through this. So it's important to understand that the students that are coming into our classes are coming in with different backgrounds. They might have different, neurodiversities. They could be like, I'm sure all of us here, even though we can't see each other, I'm sure that a lot of us we could be parts of several minority groups. And it's important that we remember and that we note that students are walking into the learning environment and they have a lot of dimensions to them, right? A lot of us have a lot of layers to us. So understanding that with your students, goes a long way in fostering safe and inclusive learning. And yes, you guys are having a lot of really good answers in the chat. Accommodation and tolerance, understanding that an individual learns at different paces with different experiences. These are all really, really, really good stuff. So in an inclusive environment, all the students can experience learning as accessible, as meaningful, and as relevant. And in an inclusive environment, all students have the feeling that they can express their ideas, they can express identity without shame or without judgment. So experiencing learning as accessible makes learning cognitively available to us. So now I'd like you guys to think back to when we were all students, but think back to when you were on the other side of the screen, when you were on the other side of the class, at the table, to, when you had a GA, and think about what are the ways that learning was made safe and inclusive for you. And, if you can't think of anything, think of the ways that you wish learning was made safe and inclusive for you. And you can answer in the chat if you feel comfortable. So these are ways I'm asking you this question because I'd really like you to have that at the forefront of your brain, that our students are diverse and they're going to come with different experiences. And it's important to us to be sensitive to that. So fostering safe and inclusive learning, it could be something as big as making an announcement that there'll be no tolerance for bullying, for trolling based on an individual's race, religion, sexuality, gender identity, or nationality, letting your students know that this is not tolerated in this class, even talking to the course instructor to know how to move forward if something like that does happen. It could be as little as even having clear learning outcomes at the start of every class. It could be as simple as providing the learning resources, making that accessible to all the students, even at the end of class. And depending on how much autonomy you have, we already talked about this before, coming up with basic ground rules for your students, on how to conduct themselves when they're in class. And finally, before we let you guys go, we want to talk to you guys about mental health resources that are available on campus. So we have the Student Counseling Center, health services, the peer support group. With the pandemic right now, the hours are a bit different, but just if you go on their websites, you can find ways that you can get in touch with somebody if you need somebody to talk to. There are also 24-hour support services, and the Community Crisis Center, the Big White Wall, the Keep Me Safe SSP app, and the 24/7 walk-in crisis service. So if any of us, understand that the pandemic has brought up a lot of different emotions and a lot of different things going on in our lives, and it's important to us to keep our mental health, to protect ourselves and make our mental health a priority. Okay, with that, we've also put some virtual, lab resources. Unfortunately, most of these are science related, and I know that we have a lot of, there are also arts and writing majors here, but these are some resources that can guide us, help us with, how to approach online learning. So these slides will be made available to you at the end of the workshop. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for coming and joining us this morning. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us.
So much everyone for attending. I know it was an early session, but I hope that you guys gained something from this and that you guys feel more confident going into this next semester as a GA or TA.